Good evening, and welcome to Nighttime Biographies. Tonight, we explore the remarkable life of Fyodor Dostoevsky, the author of Crime and Punishment and the Brothers Karamazov, a man whose own life was almost as extraordinary as the novels he wrote. On the morning of December 22nd, 1849, in Semyonovsky Square in St. Petersburg, a young man stood in the snow with his hands bound, waiting to die. The temperature hovered somewhere near freezing. A thin grey light lay over the square, the kind of light that St. Petersburg produces in late December, when the sun barely troubles itself to rise above the rooftops before sinking away again. Soldiers stood in formation. A crowd had gathered at a distance, kept back by more soldiers, watching in the particular silence that gathers around public executions. 21 men, members of a group that had done little more than read forbidden books aloud to one another and discussed the abolition of serfdom, stood in 3 groups of 3 waiting their turn before the rifles. Among them was a 27-year-old writer named Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky, already the author of one celebrated novel, already a man whose name had been spoken with admiration in the literary salons of the capital. Now he stood in a coarse execution shirt, feeling the cold work its way into his bones, watching as the first 3 men of his group were led forward and tied to posts. He was in the second group. He had, by his own later reckoning, perhaps 5 minutes left to live. Consider what 5 minutes means when it is truly the last 5 minutes, not a metaphor, not a turn of phrase. An actual mathematical certainty that in 300 seconds a rifle volley would end everything, every thought he would ever have, every word he would ever write, every person he would ever love. Dostoevsky later described the strange clarity that descended on him in that moment. He turned to the prisoner nearest him, a fellow writer named Sergei Durov, and said, quite calmly, that they would soon be together with Christ. Whether he believed this fully in that instant, or whether the words were simply what a mind reaches for at the edge of its own extinction, no one can say for certain. But he said it, and it was recorded, and it tells us something of the man he would become. He thought, he later wrote, about how strange it was that in a few minutes he would be nothing, or would be reunited with everything, and that if he could somehow escape this fate, if he were given his life back, he would treat every single minute of it as an eternity, would waste nothing, would let no moment pass unlived. This thought, born in the snow of Semyonovsky Square with a rifle squad forming up before him, would become one of the great animating forces behind everything he wrote for the rest of his life. Time itself, what a person does with the minutes they are given, how a soul uses or squanders the brief span allotted to it, would become one of the deepest currents running beneath his novels. And then, at the very last possible moment, as the officer in command raised his arm to give the order to fire, a horseman came galloping into the square carrying a message from the Tsar. The execution was to be halted. It had been, from the beginning, a piece of theatre designed by Tsar Nicholas I himself, a calculated cruelty meant to terrify the prisoners into total submission before commuting their sentences to hard labour in Siberia. The men were not to die. They were to suffer instead a different fate. Years of chains, of frozen barracks, of forced labour in a penal fortress at the edge of the civilized world. But in that instant, standing in the snow, none of them knew this was theatre. For Dostoevsky, for those 5 minutes, death had been entirely real. One of the condemned men, informed of his reprieve, went mad on the spot and never fully recovered his sanity. Dostoevsky did not go mad, but he was never, for the rest of his life, quite the same man who had walked into Semyonovsky Square that morning. Something had been burned away in him, and something else had been forged in its place. a preoccupation with suffering, with faith, with the fragile boundary between life and death that would animate everything from crime and punishment to the Brothers Karamazov. But to understand how a promising young writer came to be standing before a firing squad in the snow, we must go back nearly 3 decades, to a modest apartment attached to a hospital for the poor in Moscow, where a difficult, brilliant, endlessly troubled man was about to be born. If you find yourself drawn into this story of imprisonment, suffering, and the stubborn persistence of faith and creativity, consider subscribing so that more stories like this one can find their way to you as you drift towards sleep. Now, let us go back to the beginning. Moscow in the early 19th century was a city still recovering from catastrophe. Barely a decade earlier, in 1812, Napoleon's armies had marched into the city, and much of it had burned, some say deliberately set alight by its own retreating citizens rather than left intact for the invader. By the 1820s the city had been substantially rebuilt, but it carried within it a memory of devastation, a sense that grand structures and grand plans could be reduced to ash almost overnight. It was a city of extremes, gilded churches with their onion domes catching the light, and beside them narrow streets crowded with beggars, cripples, and the desperately poor. It was into this world, on the grounds of the Mariinsky Hospital for the Poor, that Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky was born on November 11th, 1821. The hospital was not simply a place his family lived near. His father worked there as a physician, and the family's cramped apartment stood at the edge of the hospital grounds, close enough that the young Dostoevsky would have grown up within sight and sound and smell of human suffering on a daily basis. The hospital served Moscow's poorest residents, the destitute, the abandoned, those with nowhere else to turn. From his earliest years, before he could have understood what he was absorbing, Dostoevsky lived beside the raw material of the stories he would one day tell, stories of the poor, the desperate, the forgotten souls of Russian society. His father, Mikhail Andreevich Dostoevsky, was a man of complicated temperament, a doctor by profession, disciplined and hard-working, but also, according to most accounts, harsh, suspicious, and prone to fits of anger that could turn violent. He had clawed his way up from a modest clerical family to earn a medical degree and eventually a position that granted him hereditary nobility, a status he guarded jealously, and which meant a great deal to him, perhaps because it had been so hard won. He ran his household with a rigid, often oppressive discipline, and the emotional atmosphere of the Dostoevsky home, by most surviving accounts, was one of tension rather than warmth, at least where the father was concerned. His mother, Maria Fedorovna, by contrast, was remembered by her children with tenderness. She came from a merchant family, was pious in a gentle, unforced way, and seems to have provided whatever softness existed in the household. She read to her children, told them stories from the Bible and from Russian folklore, and it was she who first introduced young Fyodor to the sound of a language shaped into narrative, the cadences of scripture, the rhythms of fairy tales told by lamplight. Between the harsh discipline of the father and the gentle warmth of the mother, a tension was set up early in Dostoevsky's emotional life that many biographers have traced through the rest of his work. A fascination with cruelty and suffering existing alongside a deep yearning for tenderness, forgiveness, and grace. Fyodor was the second of what would eventually be 7 children, though not all would survive to adulthood, as was common in that era. The Dostoevsky household was neither wealthy nor truly poor. It occupied an uneasy middle position, respectable but financially strained, always conscious of status and the fear of falling below it. This anxiety about money, about status, about the precariousness of respectability, would become one of the great recurring themes of Dostoevsky's fiction. His characters are so often people teetering on the edge of poverty, obsessed with debts, humiliated by their financial circumstances, desperate to maintain some shred of dignity in a world that seemed determined to strip it from them. He did not need to imagine this condition. He had breathed it in as a child. Each summer, the family would leave the crowded city for a small country estate called Daravoye, which Dostoevsky's father had purchased in the Tula region south of Moscow. It was here, among the fields and the peasant villages, that young Fyodor encountered something that would leave an even deeper mark than the hospital ever did. The Russian peasantry itself, in all its poverty, its faith, its endurance, and its complicated humanity. He played among peasant children, listened to their stories, absorbed the rhythms of their speech, and years later, in the depths of his own suffering in a Siberian prison camp, he would remember these early encounters with something like reverence, coming to believe that the ordinary Russian peasant carried within him a wisdom and a faith that educated society had lost. There is a story, often retold, of an incident from these summers that Dostoevsky himself recounted decades later in his writing. As a small boy, frightened by the sound of what he believed was a wolf nearby, he ran in terror to a peasant working in the fields, a man named Merry, who gently calmed the boy, made the sign of the cross over him, and spoke to him with a tenderness that stayed lodged in Dostoevsky's memory for the rest of his life. Decades afterward, while imprisoned among hardened criminals in Siberia, surrounded by violence and despair, Dostoevsky would recall this single moment of unexpected gentleness from a simple peasant, and it would become for him a kind of proof that goodness existed even in the roughest human soil. This is the sort of foreshadowing that runs through his entire life, small moments, barely noticed at the time, that would later bloom into the central convictions of his art. The name Fyodor itself, in the Russian Orthodox tradition, carries the meaning gift of God, and though we cannot know how much weight his parents placed on such meanings, it is a fitting name in retrospect for a man whose entire life would become a wrestling match with the question of whether human existence was, in the end, a gift or a curse, and whether those two possibilities might in fact be inseparable from one another. Consider, for a moment, the particular texture of daily life inside that hospital apartment. The rooms were modest, the furnishings plain, the atmosphere shaped by the rhythms of a working physician's household, early risings, the comings and goings of patients and hospital staff just beyond the walls, the ever-present awareness of illness and mortality as ordinary, daily facts of existence rather than distant abstractions. Many children grow up sheltered from the reality of suffering, encountering it first in adolescence or adulthood, as an intrusion into an otherwise protected world. Dostoevsky had no such shelter. From his earliest conscious memories, the boundary between the comfortable world of family life and the raw suffering of the poor and the sick was thin, permeable, almost non-existent. Biographers have long noted that this early, unmediated exposure to poverty and physical suffering may help explain why Dostoevsky's fiction so rarely flinches from depicting hardship in unsentimental, exact detail. He had, quite literally, grown up within earshot of it. The wider world beyond the hospital walls was itself in a state of uneasy transition. Russia in the 1820s remained an autocracy, ruled by a Tsar whose word was law, its vast population still overwhelmingly bound by the institution of serfdom, a system under which the majority of Russia's peasants were legally tied to the land and to their landowners, unable to leave, marry, or dispose of their own labour without permission. This was the fundamental fact underlying all of Russian society during Dostoevsky's childhood and young adulthood, an injustice so vast and so normalized that most of the educated class scarcely questioned it. It would take the better part of Dostoevsky's own lifetime before serfdom was finally abolished, and the tension surrounding that institution between landowner and peasant, between educated society and the vast illiterate majority whose labour sustained it, would shape nearly every major event of his life, from the political ideals that led to his arrest as a young man to the deep, almost mystical reverence for the peasantry that coloured his later writing. Fyodor's early years were also marked by the ordinary rhythms of a large growing family. Brothers and sisters arrived in close succession after him, most significantly Mikhail, born the year before Fyodor, who would remain, throughout both of their lives, not merely a sibling but Fyodor's closest friend, confidant, and eventually his literary and business partner. The two boys were nearly inseparable in childhood, sharing books, inventing games, and later, as young men, sharing dreams of literary greatness. Losing Mikhail decades later, in the same terrible year that claimed his first wife, would be one of the great sorrows of Dostoevsky's adult life. But in these early years, the bond between the brothers was simply a source of steady comfort and companionship amid a household otherwise marked by paternal severity. It was also in these earliest years that young Fyodor first began to display the nervous, intensely sensitive temperament that would characterize him for the rest of his life. Family members and later biographers, drawing on family letters and recollections, described him as a child prone to sudden, powerful emotion, moved easily to tears by a sad story, startled badly by loud noises or frightening tales, given to long periods of quiet, inward absorption, followed by bursts of exuberant talk. This was not, by the standards of the household, considered a particularly desirable temperament. His father in particular seems to have had little patience for displays of emotional sensitivity, favouring instead discipline, order, and controlled behaviour. Yet it was precisely this heightened sensitivity, this apparent inability to experience the world at anything less than full intensity, that would decades later become the very engine of his art. A calmer, more even-tempered child might never have become the writer capable of rendering, with such devastating precision, the fevered inner monologues of characters like Raskolnikov. The Dostoevsky household was, whatever its emotional deficiencies, a place that took books seriously. Fyodor's father, despite his harshness, valued education and saw to it that his children were exposed early to literature. The family read aloud in the evenings histories, the works of the great Russian poet Pushkin, the Gothic novels of Anne Radcliffe that were popular at the time, and above all the Bible, particularly the Book of Job, which would remain one of Dostoevsky's touchstones throughout his life. The story of a righteous man subjected to inexplicable suffering, who nonetheless refuses to curse God, planted itself deep in the boy's imagination and would resurface, transformed, in nearly everything he later wrote. When Fyodor was still young, his parents sent him and his older brother Mikhail, to whom he was extraordinarily close throughout his life, to a boarding school in Moscow, and later to a more prestigious institution. He proved to be a serious, somewhat withdrawn student, drawn more to literature than to the mathematics and sciences that dominated the curriculum. Those who remembered him from this period described a boy who was intense, easily moved to strong feeling, prone to nervous excitement, and already showing signs of the restless, almost feverish inner life that would characterize him as an adult. Then, in 1837, when Fyodor was only 15 years old, his mother died of tuberculosis. The loss struck him hard. By all accounts, She had been the emotional centre of whatever warmth existed in the family, and her death left a wound that never fully closed. Grief of this kind, arriving so early in a life, has a way of teaching a person that safety is an illusion, that the people we love can be taken from us without warning, and that beneath the ordinary surface of daily life runs a current of loss waiting to break through. This lesson, learned so young, would become one of the deep undercurrents of Dostoevsky's fiction, in which characters are so often blindsided by catastrophe, forced to confront the fragility of everything they had assumed was solid. Shortly after his mother's death, his father made the decision to send Fyodor and Mikhail to St. Petersburg to study at the Academy of Military Engineering, a practical, respectable career path for young men of their class, but one almost perfectly unsuited to Fyodor's actual temperament. He had no real interest in engineering. His passion, even then, was overwhelmingly literary. He read voraciously in his free hours the French novelist Balzac, the German romantics, the plays of Schiller, and above all endlessly the works of Pushkin, whom he considered something close to a secular saint of Russian letters. Classmates recalled him during this period as awkward, poor, prone to sudden and passionate opinions, uninterested in the military discipline around him, and already marked by the intensity that would define him. Then, in 1839, while Fyodor was still a student at the academy, came a second and even more disturbing loss. His father died under circumstances that remain disputed by historians to this day. The official explanation given at the time was that he died of apoplexy, what we would now likely call a stroke. But a persistent rumour, never conclusively proven or disproven, held that Mikhail Andreevich Dostoevsky had in fact been murdered by his own serfs on the estate at Darovoye, killed in an act of vengeance for years of cruelty and harsh treatment. Whether this rumour was true has never been settled with certainty, and modern historians remain divided. But what matters for understanding Dostoevsky the writer is that he himself seems to have believed, at least for a time, that his father had been murdered by the peasants he had mistreated, and this belief, true or not, planted in him a lifelong preoccupation with a question that would become the very centre of his greatest novel. What does it mean for a son to feel, in some tangled way, responsible for or connected to the death of his father? The theme of patricide, actual or symbolic, longed for or accidental, runs through Dostoevsky's fiction from beginning to end, reaching its fullest and most searching expression decades later in the Brothers Karamazov. Grief, arriving twice in such close succession, seems to have driven the young Dostoevsky, if anything, more deeply into literature rather than away from it. Fellow cadets at the Academy of Military Engineering recalled him retreating for hours into whatever book he could find, indifferent to the drilling and technical instruction that surrounded him, his true attention fixed always on the imaginative worlds contained in Balzac, in Schiller, in the sprawling historical romances then popular across Europe. He read Pushkin's poetry with what classmates described as something bordering on religious devotion, memorizing long passages, reciting them to anyone willing to listen. It was Pushkin, more than any other single figure, whom Dostoevsky credited throughout his life with having first awakened in him a full, conscious understanding of what Russian language and Russian literature might become, not a pale imitation of French or German models, but something with its own distinct voice, capable of expressing the full range of the Russian soul. He also began, during these student years, his lifelong habit of close sympathetic attention to those around him whom society tended to overlook, the servants at the academy, the poor cadets scraping by on inadequate stipends, the minor clerks and shopkeepers he encountered in the streets of St. Petersburg during his rare free hours. Friends later recalled that even as a young man not yet embarked on his writing career, Dostoevsky possessed an unusual, almost restless curiosity about the inner lives of ordinary, unremarkable people, a curiosity that would, within just a few years, find its first full expression in the pages of Poor Folk. Orphaned in his late teens, inheriting a small and quickly diminishing sum of money, Fyodor completed his engineering studies without enthusiasm and briefly took up a position as a military engineer, a job he found tedious beyond description. Within roughly a year, he resigned his commission entirely, turning his back on a stable, respectable career in order to gamble everything on the far less certain life of a writer. Friends and family considered this a reckless decision, financially and socially. But Fyodor had already, in his own private conviction, chosen his path. He would write, or he would fail trying. The years immediately following his resignation from military service were lean ones. Dostoevsky lived in cramped St. Petersburg apartments, often cold, often hungry, translating French novels for small payments to keep himself afloat while he worked, in secret and with an intensity that bordered on obsession, on his first original novel. That novel, titled Poor Folk, told the story of an impoverished aging clerk and a young woman he loves and tries, hopelessly, to protect from destitution, all conveyed through an exchange of letters between the two characters. It was, in its way, a deeply compassionate portrait of the kind of people St. Petersburg's grand literary culture routinely ignored. The clerks, the servants, the barely surviving poor who filled the city's back streets and cheap apartments. Dostoevsky poured into it everything he had absorbed as a child beside that hospital for the poor in Moscow, and everything he was now living himself as a struggling young writer with barely enough money for bread. When he finished the manuscript in the spring of 1845, he gave it to his roommate, a fellow writer, who in turn passed it along to a poet named Nikolai Nekrasov. What happened next has become one of the most cherished stories in Russian literary history, repeated and perhaps embellished over the years, but carrying at its core an undeniable truth. Nekrasov and a friend began reading the manuscript late one night, intending only to glance at a few pages, and instead read the entire thing straight through until dawn, so moved were they by what they found. As the sun came up, Nekrasov rushed to the apartment of Russia's most powerful and feared literary critic, Vissarion Belinsky, and pressed the manuscript into his hands, declaring that a new Gogol had arrived. Belinsky, whose critical judgments could make or destroy a young writer's career overnight, read the novel and was equally moved. When Dostoevsky was finally brought before him, the critic reportedly told the astonished young writer that he did not yet fully understand what he had created, that he had, in his innocence, written something of profound and lasting significance about the dignity and suffering of the poor, something Belinsky believed Dostoevsky himself, in his youthful excitement, had only half grasped the true weight of. Consider what this moment must have felt like for a 23-year-old orphan, scraping by on translation work, suddenly told by the most powerful critical voice in the country that he possessed genius. Dostoevsky later confessed that in that instant, walking home afterward through the St. Petersburg night, he felt something like ecstasy, a solemn, overwhelming joy unlike anything he had known before. He stood at his window that night, he wrote, and wept, vowing to himself to be worthy of what had just been said to him. Poor Folk was published in early 1846 and created an immediate sensation in St. Petersburg's literary circles. Overnight, the unknown young writer found himself celebrated, invited into the city's most prestigious salons, spoken of in the same breath as the great names of Russian literature. It seemed, for a brief and dazzling season, that Fyodor Dostoevsky's path forward was clear. He would be Russia's next great novelist, admired, secure, his genius recognized and rewarded. But fame of this sudden and intense kind rarely settles comfortably onto a young and anxious temperament, and Dostoevsky's second novel, The Double, published shortly afterward, was met with confusion and disappointment. Readers and critics alike found its strange, feverish tale of a man confronting his own doppelganger difficult to follow, and the praise that had surrounded Dostoevsky so completely just months before began to curdle into mockery. He was mimicked in satirical verses, teased at the very salons that had celebrated him. It was a brutal, humiliating reversal, and it left Dostoevsky, already prone to anxiety and nervous sensitivity, deeply wounded. He began to withdraw from the literary society that had so recently lionized him. It was in this period of wounded pride and restless searching that Dostoevsky, still in his 20s, began attending a discussion circle that met at the home of a minor official named Mikhail Petrushevsky. Gatherings where young intellectuals read forbidden books, discussed the ideas of French utopian socialists, debated the injustice of serfdom, and imagined, in the abstract, idealistic way of young men who have not yet been tested by real consequence, a more just Russian society. What they did was, by the standards of most nations, barely a crime at all. Conversation, reading, debate. But Tsar Nicholas I, ruling over an empire gripped by fear of the revolutions then sweeping across Europe in 1848, saw in these gatherings the seeds of sedition. In the spring of 1849, the secret police arrested the entire circle, Dostoevsky among them. He was thrown into solitary confinement in the Peter and Paul fortress, that grim citadel on an island in the Neva River, to await judgment. The fortress was and remains one of the most feared symbols of Imperial Russian state power, a place where political prisoners had been held, interrogated, and often broken for well over a century. Dostoevsky spent 8 months in a cell there, cut off almost entirely from the outside world, uncertain of his fate, permitted only limited correspondence and occasional visits. It was during this long, uncertain confinement that he wrote The Little Hero, a short story he managed to smuggle out, evidence that even isolated in a fortress cell awaiting an unknown judgment, his need to write, to shape experience into narrative, had not deserted him. The investigating commission examined the activities of the Petrushevsky circle with the exaggerated suspicion typical of an autocratic government gripped by fear of the revolutionary upheavals then convulsing Western Europe. What these young men had actually done amounted in the sober light of history to remarkably little. They had gathered on Friday evenings to read aloud, to discuss forbidden books smuggled past the censors, to debate philosophy, literature, and the injustices of serfdom, and to imagine, in the manner of idealistic young intellectuals everywhere, a more just and humane society. Dostoevsky's own specific offence centred on his having read aloud, at one of these gatherings, a banned letter written by the critic Belinsky, the same Belinsky who had once hailed him as Russia's next great writer, a letter sharply critical of the Orthodox Church and of Tsarist autocracy. For this act of reading aloud a piece of forbidden correspondence, Dostoevsky and his fellow circle members were charged with conspiracy against the state. The military tribunal that eventually reviewed their case sentenced Dostoevsky to death by firing squad. Tsar Nicholas I, however, had from the very outset intended a different outcome, one designed for maximum psychological effect. The condemned men would be marched to the scaffold, made to believe fully in their own imminent deaths, and only then, at the very last possible moment, informed of the Tsar's clemency. It was a deliberate, calculated act of terror dressed in the language of mercy, intended to break the spirit of any future dissidents through the telling and retelling of what these men had endured. And it was into this carefully staged theatre of near death that Dostoevsky was marched out, 8 months after his arrest, into Semyonovsky Square, to stand before the firing squad we met at the very beginning of this story, the mock execution that would break something in him and forge something new in its place. The commuted sentence that spared Dostoevsky's life in Semyonovsky Square was, in its own way, its own form of slow execution. 4 years of hard labour in a Siberian prison camp, to be followed by an indefinite term of compulsory military service in a remote frontier garrison. He was to be stripped of his status as a nobleman, chained, and sent into a world almost unimaginably distant from the literary salons of St. Petersburg. The journey itself took weeks, by sleigh and on foot, through the brutal cold of a Russian winter, chained at the ankles the entire way. He arrived, in January of 1850, at a prison fortress in the western Siberian city of Omsk, a place surrounded by a high wooden stockade, where he would spend the next 4 years of his life among some of the most hardened criminals in the Russian Empire. Murderers, thieves, men convicted of the most violent crimes imaginable, most of them peasants who regarded this educated nobleman, this former officer and celebrated writer, with open suspicion and often outright contempt. Year after year, Dostoevsky endured conditions that would have broken lesser spirits entirely. The barracks were filthy, overcrowded, infested with vermin. The food was barely adequate. He was made to wear heavy iron shackles that were never removed, even while he slept, for the entirety of his sentence. The clanking of those chains became, for him, an inescapable, constant reminder of his condition. He performed forced labour, breaking ice on the frozen Irtysh River, hauling bricks, grinding alabaster, work that was often pointless in its purpose, designed less to accomplish anything useful than simply to grind down the spirit of the men made to perform it. He was, for a time, forbidden even to write, the one activity that had given his life shape and meaning. Books were scarce. The only volume he was permitted to keep was a copy of the New Testament, given to him by the wives of the earlier Decembrist revolutionaries as he passed through a town on his journey into exile. He read this single book by his own account over and over across the 4 years of his imprisonment, until its pages were worn soft, and it became for him not merely a religious text, but something closer to a lifeline, a rope he held on to as everything else he had known was stripped away. It was during these years, reading and rereading the Gospels in the freezing barracks of a Siberian prison camp, surrounded by the worst that human beings could do to one another, that Dostoevsky's Christian faith, which had been a childhood inheritance, deepened into something far more personal, far more hard-won, and far more central to his understanding of existence than it had ever been before. What he witnessed in that prison camp, among men who had committed terrible acts, and yet who also displayed in flashes unexpected tenderness, humour, even nobility, convinced Dostoevsky of something he would spend the rest of his career trying to express, that no human being, however degraded by circumstance or crime, was ever entirely beyond the reach of the divine spark within them. Good and evil, he came to believe, were not neatly separated into different categories of people. They existed, tangled together within every human soul, including his own. This conviction, that the capacity for both terrible cruelty and startling grace lives inside every person, would become the deepest philosophical foundation of everything he wrote for the rest of his life. His time in Siberia also brought him, for the first time in his life, into sustained, intimate contact with the Russian peasantry, not as a landowner's son observing from a comfortable distance, as he had at Daravoy as a child, but as a fellow prisoner, sharing their food, their labour, their suffering. This experience deepened his earlier childhood conviction, forged in that half-remembered moment with the peasant Mari, that the Russian common people carried within them a kind of instinctive moral wisdom and Christian faith that educated, westernized Russian society had lost. This belief would place him, in later years, at odds with many of the progressive secular intellectuals of his own class, and would shape the distinctly conservative, nationalist and religious cast of his later political and social thought. By the time his sentence of hard labour ended in 1854, Dostoevsky was a transformed man, physically weakened, his health permanently damaged by the harsh conditions, and afflicted during this period by the first clear onset of a condition that would trouble him for the rest of his life: epilepsy. He experienced seizures with growing regularity, terrifying, disorienting episodes that would strike without warning, sometimes preceded by what he described as moments of overwhelming, almost unbearable clarity and joy just before the seizure took hold, a sensation so intense that he reportedly said he would trade years of his life for those fleeting seconds of transcendence. This strange, paradoxical experience of his own illness, suffering intertwined inseparably with something like ecstasy, would find its way, transformed, into several of his later characters, most memorably Prince Mishkin in The Idiot, who shares his creator's epilepsy and his creator's strange relationship to the boundary between suffering and grace. The social world of the Omsk prison camp was itself a study in stark and often bewildering contradictions, one that Dostoevsky would spend years processing and eventually transform into Notes from the House of the Dead. As a nobleman among common criminals, he occupied an uneasy, often dangerous position, resented by many of his fellow prisoners precisely because of the class privilege he had once enjoyed, viewed with suspicion as neither fully one of them nor able to claim any of his former status within the prison walls. He was, by his own account, deeply lonely during much of his imprisonment, cut off not only from the literary and intellectual world he had known in St. Petersburg, but often from genuine companionship even among his fellow convicts. And yet, gradually, over the months and years, he began to observe his fellow prisoners not merely as a frightened outsider, but as a novelist gathering material, noting their speech patterns, their individual histories, the strange mixture of brutality and unexpected kindness that coexisted within the same men, sometimes within the very same hour. He witnessed, during these years, moments of astonishing cruelty, brutal corporal punishments administered to prisoners, which Dostoevsky described in later writing with a horror that never fully left him, and the casual violence that marked much of daily prison life. But he also witnessed, and clung to, moments that ran entirely counter to any simple narrative of criminals as irredeemably lost souls, prisoners who cared tenderly for the sick among them, who shared what little food or comfort they possessed, who observed religious feast days with the solemnity and joy that moved Dostoevsky deeply, despite, or perhaps because of, the grim surroundings in which such observances took place. On these feast days, he later recalled, something like genuine happiness would ripple through the barracks, a brief fragile lightening of spirit that reminded him, again and again, that no human environment, however degraded, could fully extinguish the human need for meaning, ritual, and connection. Released from the prison camp itself, Dostoevsky was not yet free. He was sent instead to serve as a common soldier in a remote garrison in Semipalatinsk, in what is now Kazakhstan, at the edge of the Russian Empire's reach. It was here, still far from home, still stripped of his former status, that his life would take an unexpected turn, not toward further despair, but toward love. In Semipalatinsk, Dostoevsky, though technically still serving a form of punishment as a common soldier, found himself gradually permitted small freedoms, contact with a modest local society of officials and their families, correspondence with old friends, the slow beginnings of a return to something resembling ordinary life. It was here that he met a woman named Maria Dmitrievna Isaeva, the wife of a minor local official, a woman described by those who knew her as intelligent, high-strung, consumptive, and unhappily married to a husband given to drink. Dostoevsky fell deeply, almost desperately in love with her. Their courtship was a difficult, drawn-out affair, complicated by her husband's illness and eventual death, by Dostoevsky's own poverty and uncertain future, and by Maria's own ambivalence about attaching herself to a man whose prospects remained so precarious. But eventually, in 1857, they married. It was not, by most accounts, a happy union in any simple sense. Maria's health continued to decline. The marriage was marked by frequent separations and a growing emotional distance, and Dostoevsky's epilepsy added its own strain to their life together. And yet, in these years, something essential in Dostoevsky was slowly restored. The sense that he was still capable of ordinary human connection, of love and its accompanying disappointments after the years of chains and forced labour. Gradually, through the persistent efforts of friends and family in St. Petersburg and through a formal petition process, Dostoevsky's civil rights were restored, his status as a nobleman reinstated, and by the end of 1859 he was permitted to return at last to European Russia. He and Maria settled first in the provincial town of Tver before, finally, at the close of that year, being allowed back into St. Petersburg itself, the city he had left a decade earlier as a celebrated young novelist, and to which he now returned as a man scarred by imprisonment, marked by illness, but carrying within him, unmistakably, the deepened understanding of human suffering and human grace that would fuel the greatest work of his life. During his years in Semipalatinsk, Dostoevsky also found a devoted friend and advocate in a young lawyer and minor official named Baron Alexander Wrangel, who arrived in the remote garrison town and, recognizing the famous but disgraced writer among the common soldiers stationed there, took it upon himself to ease Dostoevsky's circumstances in whatever small ways were available to him, inviting him to dinners, lending him books, writing on his behalf to influential contacts in St. Petersburg who might help secure the restoration of his rights. This friendship, formed in the unlikely setting of a remote frontier garrison, provided Dostoevsky with something he had been almost entirely without during his years of imprisonment: intellectual companionship, and the sense that the wider world of ideas and letters he had once belonged to had not entirely forgotten him. It was also during this period that Dostoevsky resumed, cautiously and in secret at first, the practice of writing fiction, though publication remained impossible while he continued serving as a common soldier. He began drafting what would eventually become Notes from the House of the Dead, working through, on paper, the raw material of everything he had witnessed and endured during his 4 years of hard labour, a process of transforming suffering into narrative that would remain, for the rest of his career, one of his most essential creative methods. Nothing that happened to him, however painful, seemed entirely lost once it had passed through the alchemy of his writing. Even the worst years of his life became, eventually, material from which he built some of his most enduring work. He returned to a literary world that had changed considerably in his absence, and to a country itself on the edge of enormous transformation. Within a few years, Tsar Alexander II would issue the emancipation of the serfs, ending centuries of institutionalized bondage and setting Russia on a turbulent path toward modernization. Dostoevsky, ever attuned to the deep undercurrents of his society, would spend the rest of his career grappling with what this transformation meant for the Russian soul, what happened to a people and to individual human beings when old certainties dissolved and new, often dangerous ideas rushed in to fill the vacuum. Before continuing with the great works that would define Dostoevsky's mature career, it is worth pausing to consider the man himself, not the symbol, not the towering figure of Russian letters he would become in the estimation of history, but the actual particular human being who ate breakfast, argued with editors, worried over debts, and struggled through each ordinary day. Physically, Dostoevsky was not an imposing man. Contemporaries described him as of medium height, with light brown hair, a pale, somewhat sickly complexion, and eyes that struck nearly everyone who met him as remarkable. Pale, almost grey-blue, capable of shifting in an instant from a kind of dreamy abstraction to an intense, almost unsettling focus. He wore a beard for much of his adult life, kept his hair somewhat unkempt, and dressed, by most accounts, without much attention to fashion, his mind generally occupied elsewhere. The years of imprisonment and hard labour had left visible marks, a certain gauntness, the lingering effects of malnutrition, and of course the epilepsy, which continued to strike him throughout his life, sometimes several times a month during periods of stress, leaving him exhausted and disoriented for days afterward. His working habits were notoriously irregular and intense. Dostoevsky was, by nature and by financial necessity, a writer who worked against deadlines, often composing entire novels or major sections of novels at extraordinary speed to meet the demands of magazine serialization or to satisfy creditors. He tended to work late into the night, drinking enormous quantities of tea, smoking, pacing his study as he composed sentences aloud before committing them to paper. In his later years, after his eyesight and general health had deteriorated under the strain of this lifestyle, he adopted the practice of dictating his novels to a stenographer, a method that would prove, in one particular instance we will return to later, to be one of the most significant decisions of his entire life. He was, by nearly every account from those who knew him, a man of intense contradictions. He could be extraordinarily generous, giving away money he could not afford to give to friends, strangers, and former convicts he had known in Siberia who came to him in need. Yet he was also, at times, irritable, suspicious, quick to perceive slights where none were intended, prone to bitter arguments with friends and fellow writers over matters of literary or political disagreement. He possessed a somewhat old-fashioned, courtly manner in formal social settings, yet in private correspondence and in the heat of argument he could be scathing, even cruel. Perhaps the most consuming and destructive of his personal habits was his passion for gambling, particularly roulette, which took hold of him with genuine force during trips to Western European casino towns in the 1860s. He described his own gambling in letters with a kind of helpless, almost clinical honesty, the way a small win would convince him he had discovered some pattern, some system that would allow him to recover everything he had already lost, and how this conviction would send him back to the tables again and again, losing money he desperately needed, pawning his own and his wife's belongings, writing frantic letters home begging for funds to cover debts of honour at the gaming tables. This affliction, which he never fully conquered until relatively late in his life, gives us a window into the same restless all-or-nothing temperament that also drove his creative work, an inability to do anything by half measures, a soul that seemed to require extremity, whether at the gambling table or on the page. Socially, Dostoevsky maintained a small circle of close friends and a wider, more contentious set of literary and political acquaintances with whom he frequently disagreed, sometimes bitterly, over the great ideological questions dividing Russian intellectual life, the merits of Western liberalism versus Russian traditionalism, the role of the Orthodox Church, the dangers he perceived in the radical revolutionary socialist ideas gaining currency among Russia's youth. He was known to hold forth passionately at gatherings, his voice rising with conviction, his opinions on these matters unwavering even when they cost him friendships. Despite his difficult temperament, he inspired deep loyalty and affection in those closest to him, who recognized beneath the irritability and the anxiety a man of genuine warmth, deep compassion for suffering, and an almost childlike capacity for wonder that had somehow survived everything he had endured. His relationship with food and daily domestic comfort, according to Anna Grigorievna's own later memoirs, remained modest throughout his life. He was not a man given to elaborate meals or luxury, preferring simple fare, strong tea taken frequently throughout the day, and, in his later years, a disciplined if never entirely regular daily schedule built around his writing. He generally rose late in the morning, having worked past midnight the night before, took breakfast and read newspapers with close attention. He was, throughout his life, an avid and detailed follower of current events, both domestic and international, and this habit fed directly into the journalistic and political writing he produced alongside his novels. Afternoons were often given to correspondence, to walks through St. Petersburg when his health permitted, and to time with his children, whom by all accounts he adored with an openness that stood in marked contrast to the stern paternal model he himself had grown up under. Evenings, once the household had quieted, were reserved for the serious work of composition, often continuing long past midnight, fueled by tea and cigarettes, the words coming sometimes in a slow, difficult trickle, and sometimes in the kind of overwhelming flood that had to be captured as quickly as his pen or later Anna's stenography could manage. He was, in his religious observance, a sincere and committed member of the Russian Orthodox Church, attending services, observing the traditional fasts, and finding in the rhythms of Orthodox liturgy and iconography a source of steady comfort that ran alongside, and often intertwined with, the more intellectually searching and sometimes doubt-filled faith explored in his novels. Visitors to the Dostoevsky household in these later years often remarked on the warmth of the family's domestic life, a warmth that seemed almost surprising given the darkness and intensity of the fiction its patriarch was simultaneously producing in his study. Proof, perhaps, that the man and the work, while deeply connected, were never simply identical. Upon his return to St. Petersburg, Dostoevsky did not immediately produce the masterworks for which he is remembered today. The years following his release were, in many ways, as difficult as the imprisonment itself had been, though the difficulties now took different forms. He and his brother Mikhail launched a literary journal, hoping to establish both a platform for Dostoevsky's own writing and a stable source of income. In its pages, Dostoevsky published Notes from the House of the Dead, a fictionalized but deeply autobiographical account of his years in the Siberian prison camp, a work that stunned Russian readers with its unflinching portrayal of prison life and its unusual insistence on finding, even among murderers and thieves, flickers of human dignity and complexity. The book was widely read and discussed, restoring much of the literary reputation that had faded during his years of exile, and it remains to this day regarded as one of the most powerful prison narratives in world literature. but personal and financial catastrophe followed close behind this literary success. In 1864, within the span of a few devastating months, Dostoevsky's wife Maria died of tuberculosis, and shortly afterward, his beloved brother Mikhail, his closest confidant and creative partner, also died suddenly. The double loss was crushing. Compounding the grief, Dostoevsky discovered that his brother had left behind substantial debts from their shared journal, along with other family financial obligations, all of which Dostoevsky, out of a fierce sense of loyalty and honour, insisted on assuming personally rather than allowing his brother's family to bear the burden or the creditors to go unpaid. He was in effect now solely responsible for enormous debts that were not entirely his own making, a burden that would drive much of the frantic, deadline-crushed writing of the years that followed, and that would send him fleeing, at various points, to Western Europe simply to escape his creditors. The journal itself, called Time, and later, after government censors shut it down over a misunderstood article on the Polish uprising, revived under the name Epoch, represented Dostoevsky's attempt to establish an independent intellectual platform, one that positioned itself deliberately between the radical westernizing socialists on one side and the reactionary conservative establishment on the other, advocating instead for what Dostoevsky and his collaborators called native soil ideas, a philosophy holding that Russia's future should grow organically from its own religious and cultural traditions, rather than being imported wholesale from Western European models. This period of journalism sharpened and clarified many of the political and philosophical convictions that would animate his later fiction, giving him a public forum in which to test and refine ideas about faith, nationhood, and human freedom before those ideas found their fullest expression in his novels. It was also during a trip to Western Europe in 1862 and 1863, undertaken partly for his health and partly to observe firsthand the societies whose ideas he had spent so much energy critiquing from a distance, that Dostoevsky first encountered the roulette tables that would come to occupy such a destructive place in his life, and first began the tempestuous, ultimately doomed relationship with a young woman named Polina Suslova, an affair that added yet another layer of emotional turmoil to these already difficult years, even as his marriage to the ailing Maria continued its slow, sorrowful decline. Much of the raw emotional material from this relationship with Suslova, its intensity, its cruelty, its strange power imbalances, would later be transmuted into the character of Polina in The Gambler, and into aspects of several other femme fatale figures who appear throughout his major novels. It was during this period of grief, financial desperation, and gnawing anxiety that Dostoevsky began composing the work that would permanently secure his place among the greatest novelists in human history, Crime and Punishment. The novel that Dostoevsky began writing in 1865, serialized through 1866, tells the story of Rodion Raskolnikov, an impoverished former student living in a cramped, suffocating garret in St. Petersburg, who convinces himself, through a tangle of half-formed philosophical justifications, that he is entitled to murder an elderly, unpleasant pawnbroker and take her money, reasoning in the cold logic he has constructed for himself that a single unremarkable death might be justified if it allows an extraordinary man to accomplish great things for the benefit of humanity. He commits the murder. And then, across the remaining hundreds of pages of the novel, Dostoevsky traces with unrelenting psychological precision the way Raskolnikov's mind slowly disintegrates under the unbearable weight of what he has done, not because he is caught by the police, though a relentless investigator does gradually close in on him, but because the human conscience, Dostoevsky insists, cannot actually sustain the kind of cold, calculating philosophy that had seemed so persuasive in the abstract. The novel was, in part, a direct response to ideas circulating among Russia's radical youth in the 1860s, a materialist, utilitarian philosophy that suggested morality itself was merely a social construct, that a sufficiently rational and superior individual might be justified in transgressing ordinary moral rules if the calculated outcome served some greater good. Dostoevsky, who had once flirted with radical ideas himself in his younger days before Siberia, had come by this point in his life to regard such thinking as a profound and dangerous delusion, one that, if taken to its logical conclusion, could justify almost any atrocity. Crime and punishment was his attempt to demonstrate, not through abstract argument, but through the lived, felt experience of a fictional character, exactly why such reasoning inevitably collapses when confronted with the actual irreducible reality of another human life taken. What makes the novel extraordinary, and what has kept readers returning to it for over a century and a half, is not merely its philosophical argument, but its astonishing psychological realism. Dostoevsky's ability to render, with almost unbearable intimacy, the fevered, guilt-racked, self-justifying, self-loathing interior experience of a mind at war with itself. Readers do not merely observe Raskolnikov's suffering from the outside, they are made to inhabit it, to feel the walls of his consciousness closing in around them. Yet even in this darkest of stories, Dostoevsky insisted on including a path toward redemption. Raskolnikov's eventual salvation comes through Sonia, a young woman forced by desperate poverty into prostitution to support her family, whose simple, unshakable Christian faith and capacity for unconditional love and forgiveness offer Raskolnikov the one thing his cold philosophy never could: a path back toward human connection, confession, and the possibility, however distant and difficult, of genuine moral transformation. This pairing, the intellectual whose ideas have led him into darkness, and the humble, suffering figure whose faith offers a way out, would become a recurring pattern throughout Dostoevsky's later fiction. The novel is also, notably, a portrait of St. Petersburg itself, rendered with an almost hallucinatory vividness, its stifling summer heat, its overcrowded tenements, its taverns filled with desperate men and women, its bridges and canals over which Raskolnikov wanders in a fevered, half-delirious state both before and after the murder. Dostoevsky had lived in exactly this kind of cramped, oppressive urban poverty himself, both as a struggling young writer in the 1840s and again in the years immediately preceding the novel's composition, and the city that emerges in its pages feels less like a backdrop than like an active participant in Raskolnikov's psychological unravelling, its narrow, airless streets seeming almost to mirror the claustrophobic prison of his own guilty conscience. Dostoevsky also used the novel to stage an extended argument with the emerging investigator Porfiry Petrovich, whose interrogations of Raskolnikov unfold not through crude accusation, but through a kind of patient, almost gentle psychological cat and mouse, in which the investigator seems to understand with unsettling clarity that Raskolnikov's own conscience will ultimately do more to convict him than any physical evidence ever could. This depiction of psychological pursuit, rather than simple detective story plotting, was itself an innovation, and it demonstrated Dostoevsky's deepening conviction, one that would only grow stronger across his remaining novels, that the true drama of human life unfolds not in external events, but in the hidden, often self-contradictory movements of the human conscience. Crime and Punishment was published to enormous and immediate acclaim, restoring Dostoevsky decisively to the very front rank of Russian letters, alongside Turgenev and Tolstoy. But even as the novel triumphed in the eyes of the reading public, its author remained trapped in the same desperate financial circumstances that had shadowed him for years, a predicament that would, in an almost unbelievable stroke of narrative irony, lead directly to the second great turning point of his personal life. In the autumn of 1866, even as Crime and Punishment was being celebrated in the literary press, Dostoevsky found himself facing a genuinely absurd predicament of his own creation. Years earlier, desperate for immediate cash, he had signed an extraordinarily unfavourable contract with a publisher named Stelovsky, agreeing that if he failed to deliver a brand new novel by a fixed deadline, the 1st of November, 1866, he would forfeit the rights to all of his past and future works for a period of 9 years, without any further payment. It was the kind of contract a desperate man signs without fully weighing its consequences, and by October of 1866, with the deadline bearing down and no new manuscript even begun, Dostoevsky faced the very real possibility of losing control over his entire literary legacy. A friend suggested a solution. Rather than attempting to write an entire novel by hand in the few weeks remaining, Dostoevsky should dictate the work to a professional stenographer, a method that could dramatically speed the process. A young woman named Anna Grigorievna Snitkina, only 20 years old, recently trained in the still new discipline of stenography, was sent to assist him. Over the course of roughly 26 frantic days, working late into the night, Dostoevsky dictated an entire short novel, The Gambler, a work drawing directly on his own consuming struggles with roulette, to this composed, intelligent young woman who transcribed his words, then worked through the following hours to prepare a clean copy for him to review before the next session began. What began as a purely professional arrangement, born of desperate necessity, gradually transformed, over those intense weeks of shared labour against an impossible deadline, into something else entirely. Dostoevsky, then 45 years old, widowed, and worn down by years of grief and financial catastrophe, found himself falling in love with the calm, steady young woman who had appeared in his life at what seemed like his darkest professional hour. The manuscript was completed and delivered with only hours to spare before the deadline, and Dostoevsky's literary rights were saved. But the far more significant outcome of those frantic weeks was the relationship that had quietly taken root. In February of 1867, Fyodor Dostoevsky and Anna Grigorievna Snitkina were married. It would prove to be, by every account, the great stabilizing love of his life. Where his first marriage had been marked by tension, illness, and emotional distance, his marriage to Anna brought him something he had rarely known before: steady, practical, devoted partnership. Anna managed the family's chaotic finances, eventually taking over the business side of Dostoevsky's publishing affairs herself, and proving remarkably capable at it. She endured with patience his gambling relapses in the early years of their marriage, his epileptic seizures, his difficult and sometimes explosive temperament, and the constant financial precariousness that continued to shadow the family even after his greatest literary triumphs. She bore him 4 children, 2 of whom would survive into adulthood, and she would, in the final years of his life and for decades after his death, become the devoted guardian of his literary legacy. Anna herself later recalled, in the memoirs she published many years afterward, the peculiar nervousness and formality of their earliest working sessions together. A famous, difficult, 45-year-old author and a composed young woman barely out of her teens, thrown together by circumstance into an arrangement that neither could have anticipated leading anywhere beyond a professional transcription job. She described Dostoevsky's initial gruffness giving way, gradually over the course of those late-night dictation sessions, to a warmth and openness he seemed to reserve for very few people, and she recalled being struck even then by the depth of the suffering he had endured and by the seriousness with which he treated the ideas he was dictating to her, pacing his small study as he composed each sentence aloud before she committed it to paper. It is worth pausing here to consider the quiet, almost miraculous nature of this turning point. A man crushed by debt, grief, and an exploitative contract, forced into an act of desperate improvisation, finds in that very desperation the person who will steady the remainder of his life and enable the creation of his greatest works. Without Anna Grigorievna, it is difficult to imagine how Dostoevsky, given his chaotic temperament and his continuing struggles with money and health, could have gone on to produce the extraordinary sequence of novels that filled his final 15 years. Shortly after their marriage, facing continued harassment from creditors and the ever-present temptation of the gambling tables, Dostoevsky and Anna left Russia for an extended period of travel through Western Europe, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, that would last with only brief interruptions for 4 years. These years abroad were marked by continuing financial hardship, by Dostoevsky's recurring gambling episodes, which Anna endured with remarkable patience, even as they pawned her own jewellery and clothing to cover his losses, and by profound personal grief. Their first child, a daughter named Sophia, died in infancy in Geneva, a loss that devastated both parents and that Dostoevsky carried with him in various transmuted forms into his later fiction. It was during these difficult years of European exile that Dostoevsky wrote The Idiot, the novel he considered among his most personally significant, centered on Prince Myshkin, a man of almost impossibly pure goodness and Christian compassion, who also, like his creator, suffers from epilepsy. Dostoevsky set himself an extraordinarily difficult artistic task with this novel, to portray a genuinely, completely good human being, and to explore what happens when such radical goodness and honesty are set loose within the corrupt, cynical, status-obsessed society of Imperial Russia. The novel is in many ways tragic. Myshkin's goodness, rather than redeeming the world around him, is largely misunderstood, exploited, and ultimately crushed by it. Yet Dostoevsky never suggested that this made the attempt at pure goodness meaningless. Rather, the novel suggests that such goodness remains luminous and necessary even when the world proves unable to receive it. Anna's own diary and later memoirs, written and published many years after her husband's death, provide one of the most intimate surviving portraits of Dostoevsky as a private individual during these turbulent years abroad. She described his sudden shifts of mood, his tenderness toward her even in the midst of financial catastrophe, his physical suffering during and after his epileptic seizures, and the particular, almost helpless honesty with which he confessed his gambling losses to her, again and again, promising each time that this would be the last. She never portrayed him as a simple or easy man to love, but her account, written decades later with the benefit of a long and full life lived afterward, radiates an unmistakable, abiding devotion, a conviction that whatever difficulties their marriage had weathered, she had been granted the rare privilege of sharing her life with a man of extraordinary depth and genius. During these European years, Dostoevsky also observed, with a novelist's close and often critical attention, the societies of Western Europe through which he passed, the casinos of Baden-Baden and Wiesbaden, the museums and churches of Italy, the streets of Dresden and Geneva, where the family took up temporary residence for extended stretches. He developed, during this period, an increasingly sceptical view of Western European civilization, which he came to see as excessively rationalist, materialist, and spiritually hollow compared to what he regarded as the deeper, more authentic faith of the Russian peasantry, a view that would grow only more pronounced in his later journalism, and that some scholars have criticized as reflecting a narrowing, increasingly nationalist strain in his thinking during these years. Yet even as his political and religious views hardened in certain respects, his artistic powers, tempered by grief, poverty, and the steadying presence of Anna, continued to deepen. The years abroad eventually gave way in 1871 to a return to Russia, made possible in part by Anna's steady management of their finances and by Dostoevsky's own hard-won, though never total, victory over his gambling compulsion, a struggle he documented candidly in letters to Anna, promising again and again to stop, relapsing, and eventually gradually succeeding in setting the habit aside for good. Back in Russia, the family settled into a more stable domestic life, and Dostoevsky, now approaching 50, entered the final and most productive phase of his career. In the years following his return to Russia, Dostoevsky completed Demons, sometimes translated as The Possessed, a dark prophetic novel inspired by an actual murder committed by a radical revolutionary cell in Moscow, in which Dostoevsky explored with unsettling foresight the destructive potential of the revolutionary, nihilist ideologies then spreading among young Russian intellectuals. The novel was and remains controversial for its harsh portrayal of radical politics, but it demonstrated with striking clarity Dostoevsky's growing conviction that ideas divorced from moral and spiritual grounding could lead individuals and entire societies toward catastrophe, a conviction that many readers in the following century, having witnessed the actual revolutions and totalitarian movements that would sweep across Russia and Europe, came to regard as remarkably, even eerily prescient. During this period, Dostoevsky also took on the editorship of a periodical called A Writer's Diary, an unusual publication in which he addressed his readers directly on matters of politics, morality, literature, and current events, blending journalism, philosophy, and short fiction, in a format that proved enormously popular and further cemented his public standing, not merely as a novelist, but as something closer to a moral and spiritual voice for the Russian nation itself. Readers wrote to him from across the empire seeking his counsel on matters both personal and philosophical, treating him less as a mere author of fiction and more as a kind of secular prophet. By the mid-1870s, Dostoevsky, though still frequently troubled by debt and by his declining health, his epilepsy continued unabated, and he began to suffer as well from emphysema, likely worsened by his heavy smoking, along with other respiratory ailments, had achieved a level of public esteem in Russia that few writers of his era could match. He was invited to prestigious literary gatherings, his opinions on Russian society were sought after and debated, and he had, in the eyes of much of the reading public, become something close to a living national institution. The Writer's Diary allowed Dostoevsky to speak in his own direct voice, rather than through the filtered perspective of fictional characters on the questions that consumed him: the future of Russia, the proper relationship between the educated classes and the common people, the dangers of atheism and revolutionary violence, the nature of true Christian love as distinct from empty religious observance. He wrote about current criminal trials, about children he encountered in the streets of St. Petersburg, about visits to prisons and children's shelters, weaving reportage, memoir, and philosophical argument together in a form that had few real precedents in Russian letters. The publication brought him an enormous volume of correspondence from readers across the Russian Empire, students, provincial officials, clergy, mothers writing about their children, young people wrestling with doubt and despair, many of whom addressed him not as a distant literary celebrity, but as a trusted moral confidant, someone who might actually understand and respond to their most private struggles. Dostoevsky, whatever his own private demons, seems to have taken this role with genuine seriousness, answering many of these letters personally and at length. This period also saw him develop close relationships with prominent religious and philosophical thinkers of his day, including the young philosopher Vladimir Solovyov, whose own explorations of faith, reason, and Russian spiritual identity ran remarkably parallel to Dostoevsky's fictional preoccupations, and who is often cited as one of the models, along with the historical figure of the monk Ambrose of Optina, for the character of the elder Zosima in The Brothers Karamazov. Dostoevsky and Solovyov together made a pilgrimage to the Optina monastery in 1878, a journey that would prove directly significant to the novel Dostoevsky was then beginning to conceive, both for its portrait of the elder as a figure of spiritual authority and gentle wisdom, and for the broader meditation on faith, doubt, and moral responsibility that would come to dominate the book. It was in this final period of his life, drawing together the philosophical, spiritual, and psychological threads that had run through his entire career, that Dostoevsky began work on the novel that many consider not only his own greatest achievement, but among the greatest novels ever written in any language, The Brothers Karamazov. Begun in 1878 and published in serialized form through 1880, The Brothers Karamazov gathers together in a single sprawling narrative nearly every question that had preoccupied Dostoevsky across his entire life: the existence and nature of God, the problem of innocent suffering, the tension between faith and reason, the danger of ideas untethered from moral conscience, and above all, the mystery of the human soul in all its capacity for both monstrous cruelty and redemptive love. The novel centers on the Karamazov family, the corrupt, sensual, and ultimately murdered father Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov, and his 3 legitimate sons, along with a 4th, illegitimate son who serves as the family's servant. Each of the 3 principal brothers represents, in Dostoevsky's careful design, a different fundamental orientation of the human spirit. Dmitri, the eldest, is a man of passionate, impulsive, often self-destructive sensuality and honour, caught between his baser appetites and a genuine, if chaotic, capacity for love and moral awakening. Ivan, the middle brother, is a brilliant, tormented intellectual whose rigorous rationalism leads him to construct one of the most devastating arguments against the existence of a just God ever composed in world literature: his famous rebellion against a universe in which innocent children suffer, delivered in the chapter known as Rebellion, remains one of the most philosophically serious and emotionally shattering passages in all of fiction. And Alyosha, the youngest, is a novice monk under the guidance of the saintly elder Zosima, whose gentle, active love for others represents Dostoevsky's most mature and hard-won answer to the darkness posed by his brother's rebellion. Not a rebuttal by argument, but a demonstration, through Alyosha's compassionate presence in the world, of what faith actually looks like when lived rather than merely debated. The specific incident that inspired the death of a beloved young character in the novel and the surrounding community's response to his passing is believed by many scholars to have been shaped by an even more personal and devastating loss that struck Dostoevsky during the writing of this very novel. In the spring of 1878, his youngest son, Alyosha, the child he had named, tellingly, after the character he was in the process of creating, died suddenly of an epileptic seizure at not yet 3 years old, having inherited tragically his father's condition. Dostoevsky was consumed by grief. Seeking counsel in his devastation, he travelled to the great Optina monastery and spoke at length with the revered elder there, an encounter that deeply informed his portrayal of the elder Zosima in the novel he was writing, suggesting that even in the depths of the novel's most searching philosophical passages, Dostoevsky was working through his own rawest and most immediate grief, transmuting personal catastrophe into art without ever cheapening or resolving that grief too neatly. The Brothers Karamazov does not offer easy answers to the enormous questions it raises. Ivan's argument against a God who permits the suffering of innocents is never straightforwardly defeated by counter-argument. Instead, Dostoevsky answers it, if he can be said to answer it at all, through the accumulated weight of lived example, through Zosima's teaching that each person is responsible for all, through Alyosha's patient love, through the final scene of the novel in which a group of schoolboys, gathered around the grave of a young friend who has died, are urged by Alyosha to hold on to the memory of this one moment of shared love and grief as a foundation stone that might sustain them through whatever difficulties life still holds in store. It is, in its way, one of the most quietly hopeful endings Dostoevsky ever wrote, arriving after nearly 1,000 pages that had plumbed the very depths of human cruelty, doubt, and despair. Beyond the three legitimate brothers, the novel's fourth son, Smerdyakov, born of a union between the elder Karamazov and a mute, mentally disabled woman from the village, occupies a haunting liminal position within the family, resentful, embittered, and, in the end, the actual hand that carries out the murder of the father, though he insists with chilling logic that he has merely acted out the philosophical permission granted to him by Ivan's own rationalist arguments about the absence of any binding moral law in a universe without God. This device allowed Dostoevsky to dramatize, with devastating clarity, one of his most persistent convictions, that ideas, however abstract and seemingly harmless when confined to philosophical debate, have consequences in the real world, and that a thinker bears some measure of moral responsibility for what others do in the name of his ideas. Ivan's eventual mental collapse under the weight of this realization, his tormented hallucinatory confrontation with the devil who may be nothing more than a projection of his own fractured conscience, stands as one of the most psychologically harrowing sequences Dostoevsky ever composed. The novel also contains, nested within its larger structure, the celebrated parable known as the Grand Inquisitor, recited by Ivan to Alyosha, in which Christ returns briefly to earth during the Spanish Inquisition, only to be arrested by the Church's own Grand Inquisitor, who argues that Christ's gift of human freedom was itself a cruelty, that most people do not want freedom, but bread, certainty, and someone else to bear the burden of moral choice on their behalf. This parable, often read and studied entirely on its own outside the context of the larger novel, remains one of the most searching meditations on freedom, authority, and faith ever written, and it demonstrates the sheer intellectual ambition Dostoevsky brought to what might, in lesser hands, have remained simply a murder mystery involving a dysfunctional family. The novel was originally conceived as merely the first part of a larger planned work, intended to follow Alyosha through further trials and, according to notes and conversations Dostoevsky shared with friends in his final months, eventually toward a very different kind of life entirely. Some accounts suggest he intended to send Alyosha down a path involving revolutionary political activity, even assassination, before arriving at some further, unwritten resolution. Dostoevsky did not live to write this continuation, and so the novel as we have it ends not with a grand culmination, but with a smaller, quieter scene of grief and hope among a group of schoolboys, which, whether by design or by the accident of his death, gives the book the gentle, open-handed close that readers have cherished for generations. The novel was met with immense critical and popular acclaim, cementing Dostoevsky's reputation in the final months of his life as the preeminent living voice of Russian literature. In June of 1880, shortly after completing the Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky was invited to deliver a public address in Moscow at the unveiling of a monument to Alexander Pushkin, the poet he had revered since childhood. The speech he delivered that day became one of the most celebrated events of his entire public life. Speaking to an enormous, emotionally charged crowd, Dostoevsky argued that Pushkin represented something essential and unique about the Russian national character, a unique capacity for what he called universal responsiveness, an ability of the Russian soul to understand, embrace, and reconcile the many warring intellectual and spiritual currents of European civilization, and in doing so to point the way toward a deeper human unity and brotherhood. It was a speech steeped in the same themes that had animated his fiction for decades: faith, humility, the reconciliation of Western rationalism with Russian spiritual tradition, and a hopeful vision of moral reconciliation among rival factions of Russian society who had come, in these turbulent years, to regard one another with suspicion and even hostility. The effect on the audience was, by numerous eyewitness accounts, extraordinary. Witnesses described grown men and women weeping, embracing strangers, long-time ideological rivals crossing the hall to shake hands and reconcile in the emotional aftermath of the speech. It was, for Dostoevsky, the crowning public triumph of a life that had begun in a modest apartment beside a hospital for the poor, passed through the horror of a mock execution and years of Siberian imprisonment, and now arrived in its final months at this moment of near universal acclaim and apparent reconciliation, a fitting, if almost impossibly dramatic culmination to a life defined by extremes. Accounts from the hall describe the writer Ivan Turgenev, a longtime rival with whom Dostoevsky had feuded bitterly over literary and political differences for years, coming forward to embrace him amid the tumult that followed the speech. A public reconciliation between two of Russia's greatest living novelists that struck those present as almost symbolic of the broader unity Dostoevsky had called for in his address. Students reportedly wept openly and pressed forward simply to touch his hand or the hem of his coat, treating him, in the fervour of the moment, less as a literary figure than as something closer to a prophet or a spiritual father. Newspapers across Russia covered the event extensively in the days that followed, and Dostoevsky himself, in letters written shortly afterward, described the experience as among the most profound and moving of his entire life, a rare moment in which the divisions and hostilities that had characterized so much of his public and private struggle seemed, however briefly, to dissolve into a shared sense of national and spiritual purpose. He returned to St. Petersburg exhausted but triumphant, his health, however, continuing its long, slow decline. By the winter of early 1881, Dostoevsky's health, weakened by decades of epilepsy, by the emphysema that had troubled his lungs for years, and by the accumulated physical toll of a life marked by imprisonment, hard labour, malnutrition, and relentless overwork, had grown increasingly fragile. He continued to work, still engaged with his ongoing writer's diary, still receiving visitors and correspondence from admirers across Russia, still, by all accounts, mentally as sharp and engaged as he had ever been, even as his body weakened around him. On the 25th of January 1881, according to the most widely accepted account, a pen that Dostoevsky had been using slipped from a bookcase and fell to the floor. In reaching to retrieve it himself rather than asking for assistance, he strained himself, and later that day began coughing up blood, a sign, doctors determined, of a ruptured pulmonary artery, almost certainly connected to his long-standing emphysema and years of heavy smoking. Over the following 2 days, his condition worsened steadily, further hemorrhages occurring even as his family and physicians tried desperately to stabilize him. Aware by the 28th of January that he was likely dying, Dostoevsky asked Anna to read to him the parable of the prodigal son from the Gospel of Luke, the story of a wayward son who leaves his father's house, squanders his inheritance in dissolute living, and is nonetheless welcomed home with open arms and unconditional love when he finally returns in humility. It is difficult not to hear, in this final chosen text, an echo of everything Dostoevsky had spent his life writing about: sin, wandering, suffering, and the possibility, however undeserved it might seem by ordinary human logic, of grace and forgiveness waiting at the end of the road. He spoke with his children, blessed them, and asked that they be given, upon reaching adulthood, the same New Testament he'd carried with him through his years of Siberian imprisonment, the single worn book that had sustained him through the darkest passage of his life, now to be passed down as an inheritance more valuable, in his own estimation, than any worldly possession he might have left them. In these final conscious hours, according to Anna's own detailed later account, Dostoevsky remained remarkably composed, speaking with tenderness to each of his children in turn, asking forgiveness of Anna for whatever pain his difficult temperament and their years of financial hardship might have caused her, and expressing a settled, unafraid acceptance of what he understood to be approaching. He asked, too, that a portion of whatever money the family could gather be sent to the widow of a friend who had recently died, a final small act of the generosity that had characterized him throughout his adult life, even in moments when he himself had barely enough to sustain his own family. Doctors attending him could do little beyond making him as comfortable as possible. The medical understanding and treatment options available for his condition in 1881 were extremely limited, and the ruptured artery in his lung continued to bleed intermittently over the following days, despite efforts to stabilize him. Word of his declining condition spread quickly through literary and intellectual circles in St. Petersburg even before his actual death, and members of the public and press began gathering outside the family's apartment, anxious for news. This outpouring of public concern, arriving in the final hours of his life, offered Dostoevsky and his family some measure of confirmation, even amid the grief of the moment, of just how deeply and widely his work had come to be loved and respected across Russian society. A far cry from the humiliating literary failures and public mockery that had followed the publication of The Double decades earlier in the anxious early days of his career. Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky died on the evening of the 28th of January 1881 in his apartment in St. Petersburg, with Anna at his side. He was 59 years old. News of his death spread quickly through St. Petersburg, and the public response was, by the standards of the era, extraordinary. Tens of thousands of mourners are estimated to have followed his funeral procession through the streets of the city to the Alexander Nevsky Monastery, where he was laid to rest. Students, workers, aristocrats, and admirers from every stratum of Russian society came to pay their respects to a writer who had, over the course of his difficult and often turbulent life, come to be regarded as something close to the conscience of the Russian nation itself. Wreaths and delegations arrived from literary societies, universities, and religious institutions across the empire. It was, by nearly every contemporary account, one of the largest public funeral gatherings St. Petersburg had witnessed for a private citizen in living memory. He was buried near the graves of other celebrated Russian cultural figures, and upon his gravestone was inscribed a passage from the Gospel of John that he himself had chosen as the epigraph for the Brothers Karamazov. "Verily, verily, I say unto you, except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone, but if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit. It is difficult to imagine an epitaph more precisely suited to the arc of his own life. A man who had, in the snow of Semyonovsky Square, believed himself about to die, and who had spent every year granted to him afterward transforming that brush with annihilation into some of the most profound and enduring literature the world has ever produced. The influence of Fyodor Dostoevsky on the literature, philosophy and psychology of the century and a half following his death has proven almost impossible to overstate. Within a generation of his passing, philosophers across Europe were grappling seriously with the questions he had raised in his fiction. Friedrich Nietzsche, though he arrived at radically different conclusions, openly acknowledged Dostoevsky as one of the few writers from whom he had genuinely learned something essential about human psychology, remarking that Dostoevsky was the only psychologist from whom he had anything to learn. The existentialist philosophers of the 20th century, figures such as Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, drew directly and repeatedly on Dostoevsky's exploration of freedom, moral responsibility, and the potential meaninglessness of existence in a universe without clear divine guarantees. Camus, in particular, considered the Brothers Karamazov, and especially Ivan's rebellion against a god who permits the suffering of innocence, to be one of the most powerful and unanswerable articulations of what he called the absurd condition of human existence. The emerging discipline of psychology, still in its formative years when Dostoevsky was writing, found in his novels an astonishingly sophisticated map of the human unconscious, decades before Sigmund Freud began his own systematic exploration of the mind. Freud himself wrote admiringly of Dostoevsky's psychological insight, particularly his portrayal of guilt, repression, and the divided, often self-contradictory nature of human motivation, insights that Dostoevsky had arrived at not through clinical study, but through the raw material of his own suffering and his unflinching observation of those around him, in the slums of St. Petersburg and in the prison camps of Siberia alike. His influence on the subsequent development of the novel as a literary form has been equally profound. Writers as varied as Franz Kafka, Virginia Woolf, William Faulkner, and countless writers of the 20th century Russian, European, and American traditions have acknowledged their debt to Dostoevsky's innovations. His willingness to let characters speak and think in ways that were messy, contradictory, and psychologically true rather than neatly consistent. His fusion of philosophical argument with vivid, page-turning narrative drama. His refusal to offer his readers easy moral comfort, even as he never abandoned his own underlying conviction that redemption and grace remain genuinely possible. Today, more than a century after his death, Crime and Punishment and the Brothers Karamazov remain among the most widely read, translated and studied novels in the entire canon of world literature, assigned in university courses on nearly every continent, adapted repeatedly for stage, screen and opera, and still capable, as evidenced by each new generation of readers who encounter Raskolnikov's fevered guilt or Ivan Karamazov's devastating rebellion for the first time, of producing the same overwhelming, transformative effect that Dostoevsky's earliest readers described experiencing when Poor Folk first appeared in 1846. In the Soviet era that followed the Russian Revolution of 1917, a revolution whose violent, ideologically driven upheaval Dostoevsky had, in Demons, seemed almost to prophesy decades in advance. His legacy occupied a complicated position. Soviet authorities were uneasy with his deep religious conviction and his conservative political views, yet found it impossible to simply erase from the national canon a writer of such towering, undeniable genius. His works continued to be published, read, and studied throughout the Soviet period, even as official criticism sometimes strained to reconcile his spiritual preoccupations with the atheist ideology of the state. In the decade since the fall of the Soviet Union, Dostoevsky's standing in Russia has only grown, his exploration of faith, suffering, and national identity resonating with particular force in a society once again grappling with questions of meaning and moral order. Beyond Russia's borders, his influence has proven remarkably durable across cultures and eras that might otherwise seem to have little in common. Japanese novelists of the 20th century, most notably Kenzaburo Oe and Haruki Murakami, have spoken of Dostoevsky's decisive influence on their own work. American writers from Ernest Hemingway to Kurt Vonnegut have cited him as essential reading. Theologians and religious thinkers across denominational lines have turned to the Brothers Karamazov and The Idiot as some of the most serious literary engagements with Christian faith ever produced, studied not merely as novels but as works of genuine theological seriousness. Meanwhile, secular philosophers and psychologists, entirely apart from any religious interest, have continued to mine his novels for their unmatched insight into guilt, self-deception, obsession, and the strange, often self-defeating logic by which human beings so often act against their own stated values and even their own survival. University departments of literature, philosophy, theology, and even psychology continue to devote entire courses solely to his work, a rare distinction shared by only a small handful of writers across the whole history of the novel. Annual conferences convene scholars from dozens of countries to debate the finer points of his theology, his politics, and his psychological insight, more than a century after his death, a testament to the sheer, inexhaustible depth of the questions he raised and the enduring difficulty of answering them fully. His name has, in the century and a half since his death, become something close to shorthand in broader culture for a particular kind of psychological and moral intensity. To call a situation or a person Dostoevskian is to invoke, immediately and without need for further explanation, a sense of tortured conscience, extreme moral stakes, and the possibility of redemption arising unexpectedly from the depths of degradation. Few writers in the history of world literature have had their own name transformed so thoroughly into a shared cultural vocabulary for describing the human condition itself. Perhaps most remarkably, the very biography of Dostoevsky's own life, the mock execution, the years of Siberian imprisonment, the devastating losses, the gambling addiction, the epilepsy, the desperate financial struggles, and the eventual hard-won triumph and public reconciliation embodied in the Pushkin speech, has itself become a kind of enduring parable, studied and retold precisely because it so closely mirrors the themes that animate his fiction. That suffering, however unbearable it may feel in the moment of its endurance, does not necessarily destroy a human being, and may in fact become the very ground from which the deepest wisdom, compassion, and creative achievement eventually grow. Let us return for a moment to that morning in December of 1849, to the snow of Semyonovsky Square, to a young writer standing bound before a firing squad, believing with absolute certainty that he had perhaps 5 minutes left to live. In that unbearable stretch of time, Dostoevsky resolved that if his life was somehow given back to him, he would waste none of it, that he would treat every remaining minute as something precious beyond calculation. It would be pleasant to say that he kept this vow perfectly, that the rest of his life unfolded as a serene fulfillment of that solemn promise made in the snow. It did not. The years that followed brought further suffering. The chains and forced labour of Siberia, the deaths of a wife, a brother, and 2 beloved children, the grinding poverty and humiliating debts, the destructive pull of the gambling table, the relentless, unpredictable violence of his epilepsy. Dostoevsky's life, examined honestly, was not a simple, uninterrupted march toward wisdom and peace. It was messy, contradictory, and marked by real failure alongside real triumph, much like the characters he created. And perhaps this is precisely why his work has endured so powerfully and continues to speak so directly across the distance of more than a century, to readers living in circumstances he could never have imagined. Dostoevsky never pretended that suffering was simple, or that faith erased doubt, or that redemption arrived without cost. What he insisted upon, again and again, through Raskolnikov's fevered confession, through Mishkin's gentle and ultimately tragic goodness, through Ivan's unanswerable rebellion and Alyosha's quiet, persistent love, was something both simpler and more difficult than easy comfort. That within every human soul, however far it may have wandered, however deeply it may have sinned or suffered or doubted, the possibility of grace remains, not guaranteed, not easy, but possible. He showed us, across the whole difficult arc of his own life and in the pages of the novels that life produced, that a person standing in the snow, believing themselves seconds from annihilation, might yet be granted decades more of living, and that those decades, however hard, however marked by loss and struggle, could still become the raw material from which something enduring, something luminous, something worth handing down to every generation that follows, might yet be made. There is a particular kind of comfort available in a life examined this closely, this honestly, a comfort quite different from the easy reassurance of a story in which everything works out simply and everyone lives happily ever after. Dostoevsky's life offers no such simple reassurance. It offers instead something sturdier, proof that a human being can pass through the very worst that existence has to offer, the shadow of execution, the chains of imprisonment, the death of children, the grip of addiction, the long grinding years of poverty and debt, and can still, somehow, keep making, keep loving, keep reaching toward whatever light remains available. Not because the darkness was not real. It was entirely real, described in his own letters and in the recollections of those who loved him with an honesty that spared no one, least of all himself. But because darkness, in Dostoevsky's hard-won understanding, was never the whole of the story, there was always, even in the coldest cell, even in the depths of the most desperate despair, some further possibility waiting to be discovered. A peasant's unexpected kindness, a wife's patient devotion, a stranger's letter arriving at just the right moment, a single chosen passage of scripture read aloud in the final hours of a life, offering, even then, one more chance at understanding, one more chance at grace. Perhaps that is the quietest and truest lesson to carry forward from this long, difficult, ultimately luminous life, that whatever weight you may be carrying tonight, whatever uncertainty waits for you in the hours or years ahead, the story is not yet finished. There is still time being granted to you, minute by minute, the very gift that a young man once believed, standing in the snow of a Russian winter, had already been taken from him forever. Let that thought settle now, gently, as you rest. A man once stood bound in the snow, certain his story was ending. It was, in fact, only beginning to be written, through Siberian winters, through a stenographer's steady hand, through the patient love of a wife, through the grief of a father who lost a son and gave that son's name to a character who would carry hope forward on the final page. His life reminds us that the ledger of a human existence is rarely closed at the moment we fear it will be, and that even the coldest mornings can in time give way to something unexpected. Thank you for spending this time with the life of Fyodor Dostoevsky. If this story moved you, consider subscribing so that more quiet, reflective journeys like this one can find you as you drift toward rest. Until next time, may your own nights be gentle and your own mornings be met with the same quiet gratitude that Dostoevsky, against every hardship, somehow managed to carry with him to the very end. Good night.